Having some trouble accepting the request. Yeah. Hi, Tyagi. It took
Hello.
some while for me to figure it out. So, hi guys. Welcome to the show back again. I couldn't do the last week show because some personal reasons. Today I have Thyagi Ruwanpathirana. She's a researcher at Amnesty International South Asia. I would like to talk with Thyagi about the oppression the government of Sri Lanka has been uh, uh, having towards especially towards the peaceful protesters. Uh, I would like, let's be frank, this kind of oppression has been endured by the people from the north for a long, long time. And when it comes to the majority, for the last month or two, I would say yes. And I would really like to thank Thyagi and Amnesty International for using their observers during last week protest. You might have seen IUSF protest was observed by Thyagi and Amnesty International team. I think it reduced a little bit of oppression. I mean, like if they use this much of oppression, I mean, they actually reduced it a bit. I mean, they still kidnapped a few people. Yeah, but thank you, Tyagi. Thank you for all your works and welcome to the show. So my first question for you is Tyagi. So this oppression and violence, will this ever end or at any other point? Tyagi, your line is breaking actually. I think your voice is. They have some network issue.
I just put it on my.
Hello?
Yeah, is it better?
Yeah, now better. Yeah, you can talk.
Yeah. No, so I'm Sri Lanka violence had.
Tyagi, your voice is actually breaking. Like sometimes the audio is not like half of the audio is we can't hear.
Okay. Is this better?
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess you can talk. Let's see.
Okay. So what I was saying was post independence Sri Lanka has seen many cycles of violence, right? So we've seen there've been two armed insurrections, one in the 70s, one in the late 80s. Then we've had a 30-year war, especially in the north and the east, since 2000 and since 1990. And then even post independence, post the end of the war in 2009, we've also seen cycles of violence where oppression against journalists and dissidents continued, using things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which we see today. Right? So it's hard to say whether this will ever end. I guess it depends on the kind of authoritarian governments we have, the kind of independence we could expect from members of law enforcement or law enforcement authorities, for example, the police, the army, for example. The army shouldn't be involved in police protest as a significant function. So that's something the police has to be doing, but that's the problem. Right? There is no proper way of keeping the police to account as well. So I think if you take a step back, one of the main reasons it keeps happening is also because we don't have proper accountability systems. If the police abuses the law, takes the law into their own hands, tortures people, which is not something that is allowed even by Sri Lanka stands, and let alone international law, then there should be proper systems in place to hold them to account. But we don't do that. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why we keep seeing repeated cycles of violence.
So, if from your answer, I got one thing. So, basically, police and army has been doing this forever, right? This oppression that they've been doing it forever. So, you are saying they are basically ignoring the constitutional rights, or they do not know at all. Like they do not know what is human rights is.
I don't know if you saw the Human Rights Commission's investigation report. They put out an interim report after the Rambukkana violence. Remember where there was a protester who was shot to death? And after that, there was a report that the Human Rights Commission made public. Media carried it as well. And basically, there were about 4 or 5 reasons that the Human Rights Commission identified as to why things went so wrong there. And it identified that the kind of people who did the firing, that they had no proper training, they were new, they weren't trained with human rights knowledge and things like that. There are, human rights courses, for example, that the army and police sometimes have to go through, but sometimes it's just not taken seriously. And there is no slap on the wrist in case you don't stick to the law, stick to your the rule books. Because
So
human
it's
rights,
just about obey the order that's coming from top, nothing else.
exactly, and it's also because the powers that be it within the political sphere or within the civil service, they don't really understand human rights or promote human rights in that way.
Okay. So do you think this is mainly and only happening because political influence?
It could be that as well. I mean, that is a very big part of it because there is no proper mechanism to hold the police to account, right? We have something called the National Police Commission, and even that, it's one of the 11 or so commissions that are appointed by the Constitutional Council, which was replaced by the Parliamentary Council with the 20th Amendment. And that the appointment process for that again is flawed. So these are the systems that are supposed to be in place to act as a check against abuse of power of the police, who otherwise polices the police. So those are things that we need to talk about, and that's why with constitutional amendment discussions that are going on now with the 22nd Amendment, these become important because holding these systems we have to account, we need to have that check. And yes, it is very politicized because the Parliamentary Council, the way the council works and the kind of way the appointments are made is deeply politicized.
So So you might have seen what happened, like I think a couple of weeks back. I think on the 9th, if you would have seen, like a couple of toddlers were like very brutally handled by the police. What do you think of it? What is your stance of it? Like as a personal, like in your personal opinion, and also the amnesty way, like so is it their parents' fault to bring in the kids, or even like parents can bring the kids, but the police were wrong about how they handled it? So, what is your stance, and what is Amnesty's stance on this?
So protests can happen planned or unplanned, right? So you can be at a public space, you can be anywhere, and anyone has the ability to join an unplanned protest. That's basically what the international law says. So if it is, for example, a protest in a public space, which it was because it was at God's protest, there could be people with children. Whether they choose to take part in the protest or not, the decision for the guy. Those people. So it's not about whether they
Thyagi, your line is audio is again breaking. So
Is this better?
yeah, better.
Yeah. So I think the focus here shouldn't be that is it right for parents to bring kids to protest. I think the question we should really be asking is why did the police use force at these protests? Because if it's a peaceful protest, you shouldn't be using force in the first place. Because people are constitutionally and by international law standards allowed to protest. Sri Lanka has made those commitments to its people. So because of that, I think someone had tweeted saying who brought the police to the protest. It shouldn't be the
I
question
mean,
that who
and
brought the people.
after all, it was not a protest. It was just a memorial thing that was happening that day. And the way, so for me personally, what I saw was police sending a message. If you are trying to come to a protest hereafter, like, I mean, don't come. Like, they are literally saying without saying, don't come. Like, basically. So it was like they did it on purpose. I mean, they've been doing it for a long time. You can't even do a peaceful vigil anymore, like a normal silent protest anymore. If you go like 10 people crowdedly go in the road, and they would say you're blocking the road, and they can start beating you up, or they can get you inside for custody. While they were the ones who have been blocking the roads. If your observers might have noticed during last protest as well. So basically, Sri Lankans have freedom of speech, or Sri Lankans do have freedom of speech, but to a selective box.
By law, we do, because that's what the constitution says. By the ICCPR Act, which is something that Sri Lanka has signed up to, we do. But whether these are enforced is a completely different matter, right? So one way we can keep the state to check is that, the ICCPR Act, for example, there's a ICCPR review, a universal periodic review happens every 4 or 5 years, an ICCPR Act review happens, but also just purely by domestic legal standards, if your fundamental rights are infringed upon, then you can file a fundamental rights application. Those are the domestic remedies available. So it's not that these rights aren't there, it's the fact that the government either selectively applies them or really violates people's rights in violation of their own international and local obligations as well.
Currently, if you might know, there have been more than 200 arrests for participating in months of protest, and three of them were detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. After, on the 50th day, Hashan Jivanta was released, like unconditionally, because they couldn't find anything. Still, it's after 64 days, Vasanta Mudalike and Siridam Mahimi is inside. So, what is Amnesty International's stance about all this? How come Amnesty International help prevent it happening in future?
So what we're trying for the long
I think you need to get the yeah, better.
So for the longest time, we've been saying, and not just us, so many people internationally and locally have been saying that the PTA has to be repealed. It was a law that was brought in 1979 as a temporary measure, and now it's become a permanent feature of our security laws, and it's been abused time and time again. Even during the war with the combatants in the north and east, it was abused to detain people for a very long time. It was used as it was an act that facilitated torture, and now in a post-war context as well, we're still using it, and I think people are beginning to question it more and more, because now people who even thought that, oh, the PTA, we should have it because how are you otherwise going to deal with terrorists, they're like, oh, but these are student protesters. I think those questions are being asked now, but I think what they've missed all this time is that this is fundamentally a bad law that's abusive. It's not just when it applies to the Sinhalese or if it applies to student protesters that we need to be talking about it. It's been a bad law for a very long time, abusing a lot of innocent people. So I think our stance is obviously that, I've seen the detention orders as well from their lawyers. We've been calling for their release because the kind of acts that they are suspected or accused of are not things that should be going under a Prevention of Terrorism Act. The threshold for terrorism is so much higher. It needs to be, if there is credible evidence that they've committed some kind of criminal offense. So, for example, if there is credible evidence that they committed trespass or something like that, like acts of civic disobedience, then the state has the prerogative to take action against them, but using ordinary penal laws. Using the PTA is completely an overkill. So we are completely against the use of the PTA against these protesters. We still call for the PTA to be repealed, and until such time, there has to be a moratorium on it, and that's what we've been saying for a very long time as well.
So who sets the bar for terrorism? Who decides who is a terrorist, who is not a terrorist, right?
So
There
are international standards on
yeah.
this, and none of our laws that have come into being. So PTA, consecutive governments have tried to tweak the PTA several times. There was a counter-terrorism bill that the Yapalana government brought in as well. It was still in bill form, and there was a lot of issues with that as well. And now we're hearing that the current government is trying to replace the PTA with something called the National Security Act. But unless these things are really drafted with international law standards in mind, it could be very problematic. And that's what we are dealing with right now. And actually, the Special Rapporteur on Countering Terror and Human Rights has written to the government some time ago, this year, if I'm not mistaken, and she has laid out certain criteria that the government should look into if they're trying to amend the PTA. And that's a good framework to go by. And even for people like the European Union who are looking at GSP Plus or any other international body, I think the Special Rapporteur's correspondence with the government gives a good framework to judge any future laws by as to whether or not it sticks to international law.
So basically, so let's say from what we're seeing is the new counterterrorism law that they are going to bring doesn't fulfill the international requirement. So at least until that, you would feel like this law should be repealed, or the PTA should be repealed immediately, or we should prepare a new law, and until that the PTA can stay, like so that they can bring a new.
I would say the PTA needs to be repealed immediately, but if the government stance is that it can only be repealed after they bring in something to replace it, then there at least has to be a moratorium that they stick to. What's happened is that the government promised the international community earlier this year that there would be a moratorium on it, but come September, not even September, come August, they used it against the protesters, basically going against their own commitment. So that's the problem. I think there's a bit of a debate even with the society whether the PTA needs to be repealed or repealed and replaced. And that's a tenuous one because what some civil society says is that cumulatively, the kind of security laws we have in the country have the effect of having a counter-terror law. Basically, there are provisions in existing laws that can deal with a situation of terrorism. But what others say is that that each country is supposed to have some kind of counter-terror measures, which is a commitment at the UN that countries have made. So because of that, we need to have a special terrorism law. Whichever way you stand on it, I think the basic thing that everybody agrees on is that the PTA still has to go, and until then, there has to be a moratorium on it that the government is serious about.
So while they repeal the PTA, do you think all the political prisoners who have been inside for a long, long time now, ever since the war finished, like they've been a lot of political prisoners are inside, like they still, some of them still couldn't prove they're like involved in terrorism. Like there are like people like recently taken Vasanta or Sirdam Hamd. All these political prisoners should be released immediately as well.
I'm not sure at the moment how many political prisoners are there who are not charged. Sometimes it's the case that, the PTA is a really abusive law that basically prior to it being amended earlier this year, it meant that without charging someone, you could detain someone for up to 1.5 years. And sometimes you can keep for even longer as long as you keep producing them before magistrate. After
We
the
saw
amendment,
Hijaz case actually.
Hijaz was charged before his 18 months was up. But there are other cases where people have been charged after 3 years. In the East, for example, I think there's a case of Mohammed Imran that we've spoken about. But the problem is that, and now, earlier this year, they amended that law and tried to bring it down slightly. So now the case is that you have to still find some charge and charge them within a space of 12 months. But even with this 12-month requirement, you can still keep producing someone before magistrate and drag on a case without charging someone. Basically trying to say that we have some evidence to show that this person is involved in some terrorist activity, and because of that, we're going to keep investigating. So because of that, we need to keep detaining them. So that's the kind of line of reasoning that the police PID or the TID uses in front of judges. So the problem is that, when you have such an abusive law, it could be used against anyone. You see it with Vasanta, you see it with Sri Damatero, you see it with writers in the past, you see it with Hijaz's case. Even
Hashan,
exactly. I mean, Hashan was released without anything, and that's a good case. But who's going to compensate for the number of
50
days?
days,
Exactly.
or the
Spent.
mental health thing.
And, detention conditions in Sri Lanka are atrocious. And the PTA, because of the kind of provisions and the powers given to authorities through the PTA, really open people up for abuse. That's why we really need to reform the law, but more importantly, repeal it.
Before I end it, why Amnesty International is so interested in what's happening in Sri Lanka?
Um, Well, I guess it's also because Amnesty International went through a process of change. You know how human rights is always seen as a white person's concept. That's not the case, right? So it was an organization that started in 1960.
You need to close the camera, I think. Yeah.
It's something that started in the 1960s, and it was a very British organization headquartered in London. We realized that, it becomes very preachy for somebody, a white person in London, to be telling governments, especially in the global south, about human rights. So we changed that model. Now, Amnesty has 18 regional officers around the world, and so we're actually on the ground doing the work. So in Colombo, we have the regional office for South Asia. And I work on Sri Lanka, for example, and these are things that are important to me as well because human rights in Sri Lanka is matter to me. And it's also the case that one of Amnesty's strategic priorities globally has become, for the next 4 years, is on the right to protest. So I'm not sure if you've seen, we have a hashtag called Protect the Protest.
Protect the protest, yeah.
Exactly. So Sri Lanka has become obviously a kind of hotspot for cracking down on protests in the region. And I'm not saying that, this doesn't happen in Bangladesh, that this doesn't happen in India, that this doesn't happen in Pakistan. It absolutely does. It totally happens in Afghanistan. But I think access-wise, it's easier for us because we're based here. And I guess that explains maybe why we're focused on Sri Lanka so much.
So, as an international community, do you all have much to say about what's happening locally? Like, you all can issue statements, or you all can send observers. Like, can you all do more than that? Like, as an international community, like society, can you all push a government to say, "Oh no, you are doing this wrong. Don't do that." Like, you all have the authority to say that. Like, can you all do more than that?
I mean, I guess anyone can say that, right? We produce reports, we send letters to government, we do petitions, we do campaigns,
No, I'm asking, like, is there any outcome after that? Like, from the
so,
government side, like.
so it's up to the government whether they want to take it or not, right? But at the end of the day, we are basically reminding the government that these are commitments you made to the international community as well as to your own people. But then I think what's important is that at the end of the day, your human rights record matters when it comes to foreign relations, especially given the situation Sri Lanka is in now
The
with
Geneva. Yeah.
not just Geneva, but like even with economic crisis, right? Because who would want to give or provide any support to governments that are abusive, who are corrupt, who are wasting any money that's given to them? Because corruption and human rights are also very deeply linked.
So yeah, I think that was a tough question anyway. So thank you so much, Tyagi, for participating in today's session. For next week, I'm actually talking about mental health. I have a psychologist coming in with me. So join with me for next week as well. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Tyagi. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.